My name is Alexei Nesterov, and some people already, I guess, who watch Twitch, mining Twitch a lot, they know that a lot of mining authors, they actually present their books and they show basically this stream to promote the books. But this stream is going to be slightly different. So it's not going to be about a book, it's going to be about a life project, which is another cool kind of direction that mining is working on as well. So I'm gonna talk about what the life project is, what does it do, how does it look like, how can you basically start using that, and how can you get the most of it. And I'm gonna talk about the project I created, and if you're interested, you can also get a discount on this project, and I'm gonna send the link. You can basically find it in a calendar, so you can just get to this course actually from this page, from the landing page on freecontent.mining.com. And I'm gonna basically just show you around to show what it is. So I guess people are joining now, so we can start. So yeah, another round of introduction. My name is Alexei Nesterov. I'm a creator of this live project called Building an E-commerce Web Application with Spring Boot, which is a live project on mining.com. And before I get any further, I probably should explain what live project is and how is it different from what you used to see from mining, such as books and videos and other educational content. So a live project is actually quite a fancy idea. is an attempt to for people learning like technology or learning a certain something basically. To let them work on an almost real project, on an almost real software project, and basically let them build an application or maybe a small piece of application following the recommended set of steps. And that's basically how it works. So in the project, in any live project, you can find them on the mining page. You can basically see a list of projects. The one I created called Building an E-commerce Web Application with Spring Boot. And that project is about, as I said, it's supposed to be like almost real software project. So I decided to kind of show you how to create a web application, specifically e-commerce web application. And we're going to talk about different features of this app in a second in Spring Boot in Java. So if you are coming from different technology, if you let's say know Node.js, Python, PHP or something, and if you want to learn a little bit of Java and modern Java development, or maybe you experienced Java developer already, but you don't know Spring Boot, maybe you know other technologies, other frameworks in Java ecosystem, and you want to learn Spring Boot, that's a project for you. So you're going to learn about fundamentals of Spring Boot, how to build a structured application, how to basically drive your application from the very beginning to the very end. And my idea was not just to show you a little aspect of this application, because you can see here on the left, you can see the content of this course. And basically here on the left, you can pretty much see all the important steps in the building the web application, right? So you see like different features, and in the end, what I think is super cool, is super important about this project, is you can also see the final step, which is packaging and deploying the application. So you can start with basically with nothing, with no project whatsoever, and you're going to end up with an application running in AWS in EC2 instance available to the public internet. So if you want to use it for your CV, or if you want to use it just to maybe experiment with it a little bit, you can totally do that. So I said that this is not just a web application, that's an e-commerce web application. And e-commerce web application is usually has a certain set of features, right? So the catalog is the obvious one. You just want to show the items you want to sell. Apparently you're going to have something like a basket or a cart basically, so you can add items and then check out. So you probably want your user to be able to register and log in with their account, or maybe using any social media like Facebook or Google or something. And most likely you're going to want to charge people for the goods you're trying to sell. So checkout is the essential part of any e-commerce web application. And in my case, I'm using PayPal to show you basically how can you integrate payments into your web app. Pardon me. So yeah, so this is it. So basically, this is in an e-commerce application in Spring Boot, and this is part of the live project, right? So in the live project, you're gonna get a set of what is called milestones, and every milestone will include definition of the story you need to be working on. So the first one is maybe not very representative. So let's take the second one, building catalog. That's the second milestone of the course. And in every milestone, you're going to get an objective. You're going to get a short intro into why is it important for the project. You're going to get, most importantly, you're going to get a user story to implement. So the user story is if you look into, let's say, start a job, a career in software engineering, this is probably how you're going to see your items in the backlog to implement. So this is how you're going to see your basically what you need to be working on, most likely. But from user story, which is written from the perspective of a user, you're also going to see a recommended workflow. And this recommended workflow is basically what I created. So I kind of trying to guide you through the steps you need to take without too much details, without going too deeply into what exactly you need to do. So it's not a tutorial by all means. It's not something you can use like, copy and paste code and quickly throw something together and get it up and running. It's not an article. It's more almost like a real project, right? You have a story to work on, and you have a recommended flow from me, but you don't have to follow it. So the ultimate goal is to implement that user story. So if you can achieve that in a different set of steps or in a completely different order, that's absolutely fine. Just feel free to do whatever works for you. But if you don't feel comfortable with just, starting from scratch, that's probably a good step-by-step recommendations of what you need to do to actually get to the end goal. And what is also super cool about the live project, not just this particular one, building an e-commerce web application, but about any live project on Manning website, is in addition to just recommended steps, you also gonna get access to relevant books and resources from Manning. So let's say if that's the, in my case, let's say I'm talking about different approach to software testing in this case, and you can see that there are even parts of the book called Unit Testing Principle, Practices and Patterns included into the course itself. So you don't have to buy it, it's already basically included. So you can just read it in here, embedded. You can access the book for the duration of the course as well. And let's say it's not just one book, right? In this case, I'm using multiple books, and the one that if you're going to start working on this project, you're going to see that I'm using a lot of chapters from this book called Spring in Action by Craig Walls. That's an amazing book. And you can find pretty much all the information about Spring Boot development in that book. So I think the combo of this course and this book is a best way to learn Spring Boot and develop something real in Spring. Some people got confused actually. Some people asked me about that, why the domain is different. So Craig is using Taco Cloud, as he calls it. It's basically an application to show like a tacos or something. I don't even know what's there. Well, I mean, I know what tacos are, but I don't know what the application does. So, but the thing is, if you see something related to tacos, that's probably Craig's part. And if you see something related to cakes, that's probably my part. Because the project is all about implementing a web commerce application website, basically, for a bakery in North London called Cake Factory. So this is, again, completely made up, doesn't exist. Maybe it does actually, I never checked that. So it doesn't exist. And imagine this company is trying to build a small website to actually sell, pastries and cakes and something to the customers around, with some delivery, with, accepting payments online and etc. It's fairly simple, pretty basic, but still something interesting. So that's what is Live Project. And for people who just joined, I'm going to remind that what I'm talking about is a live project called Building an E-commerce Web Application with Spring Boot, the live project I created for Manning. And what I'm going to show you today is basically how you can get started with this project and implement some of the first steps in the project, getting started and building a catalog. So I'm not just gonna show you just like going step by step, although a little bit of that as well, but I'm actually gonna show you some important aspects, and I want to highlight things like using tests for writing software. Again, if you're just coming to the industry, if you never worked on a software project, you may have heard of software testing, and maybe you heard of TDD as well. For experienced people, I'm pretty sure experienced developers, they know about testing a lot, but not all of them heard about TDD. So TDD is test-driven development, and it's basically how can you create your software guided by tests, so you can use tests to actually guide your development step by step. I'm going to show you how it works. So basically, imagine I just joined this project, and I want to build this e-commerce application for a company called Cake Factory. And I'm going to get started with the very first milestone. So basically, I'm just going to go step by step as you would normally do. And my plan is in the next 45-50 minutes, just may finish milestones 1 and 2, and just to show you how it may look like. And in the end, I can just also quickly show you how the final application going to look like, and what you're going to get in the end when you complete the project. But let's start from scratch. Pretend we just joined the project and we want to do that. So I'm going to just follow the steps in here. So my objective for the first milestone is just to create an empty project in Spring Boot that serves as static HTML page with no logic whatsoever. So again, there is a recommended workflow for pretty much every milestone. You can use that. I kind of know it already by heart, and it's already, I spent so much time actually writing that and shuffling that around just to get it better laid out for you. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to sometimes have a look at this, but most likely I'm just going to do it without any workflow, but I will try to follow pretty much the same steps. So I'm going to start with the project. As one of the Spring developer advocates, Josh Long, called the second best place on the internet, which is called Spring Initializer. And the Spring Initializer is the website that helps you to quickly create and start developing a Spring Boot application. So Spring Boot application, let's say in my case, I'm going to be using a Gradle project with Java based on Spring Boot 2.4. I'm going to give it a name. Let's say I'm going to call it Cake Factory, which a reminder is the name of the company I'm building a website for. And I'm going to call it a demo project for Manning. Cool, so I'm going to use jar packaging and Java 11. And maybe in the meanwhile, so what I'm going to need to do, I'm also going to need to add some dependencies to my empty project, right? So this, as I know for the first milestone, I need to display an HTML page. This means in Spring World that I'm going to need to create an MVC. Most likely I'm going to need to have an MVC controller. And I'm going to need to have some templating engine because I'm going to render some HTML. In my case, I'm going to use Mustache, but again, it's up to you. You can use any view technology if you want. If you prefer Thymeleaf, that's totally fine. If you want to use, what else is there? Like pretty much anything you want to use, feel free to do so. But I'm going to be using Mustache, and I'm going to explain why in a second. So imagine these are only 2 dependencies I need, right? So I'm going to click generate, and I'm getting this project that I can get up and running quickly. Another question some people ask is about the setup, about the tools and technologies you're going to be using in this course. And I would say use whatever works for you. So I'm IntelliJ IDEA fan. So let me open it for you. So I love IntelliJ IDEA and I'm using it a lot. So I'm going to be using that for the demonstration, for the stream. But if you don't like it, if you don't have it, you can use whatever tool you're using for Java development. Visual Studio Code will work just fine. I don't know, what else is there now? Eclipse, Spring Tool Suite, whatever you like, it doesn't really matter. So I'm going to be using IntelliJ for this stream, and I increased my font sizes and everything, so hopefully you can see it all right. Feel free to basically post questions in chat and any comments, any questions you have. I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat, so sometimes you're going to see me looking at the different sites, but that's all right. Right, so this is the empty Spring Boot application. So for people who know Spring Boot, they know that it's fairly opinionated about how the project layout should look like, what should be in the which folder, and we're going to be using that a lot. So if I go back for a second to my first milestone, and I see that, okay, so the goal is to build an empty HTML page, right? So I use Spring Initializer, I declare dependencies. I'm not going to use Spring Boot DevTools, but again, it's just for the purpose of the stream, just to save us a bit of time. And the next one is, let's create a landing page, right? So we need to create a landing page and display something when we go to application main page to /. So if you feel like you're a web designer, you're absolutely free to create something from scratch, like design the whole HTML page with CSS and JavaScript. I don't feel that brave today, so instead I'm going to be using a template which is called Start Bootstrap Shop Template, and it's fairly basic. It's pretty, I would say, fundamental e-commerce web application website layout. You see, like you have a list of categories on the left, you have some like a gallery to highlight the important stuff you want to promote, and then you see the full catalog of items basically on your landing page. So far so good. So I'm going to download it as a zip folder. I don't even need to check it out, basically as a Git repo. By the way, I highly recommend you to use Git for that. Even if you're doing like a local development, you're not gonna probably deploy it anywhere, but feel free to use Git and GitHub and actually submit your work in there. And we're gonna talk about submission in a second, actually. So yeah, let me copy the files I need. So I'm gonna need these files, right? So as I said, Spring Boot is fairly opinionated about the file structure. So what I've done, I've downloaded the template, I extracted it locally, and then I copied basically just these two folders in one file from the downloaded archive, which is CSS and vendor, and index.html is my template. Well, it's at the moment it's just a static page basically, right? So I can actually even run the application as is, and you will see the landing page. But let's make it a little bit more interesting, and let's make it a template actually. So to make it a mustache template, what I need to do is just I need to change the extension to mustache, and immediately you get this HTML file converted into a template. So I can start putting logic into that. But that's not the purpose of the first milestone, I know that. So for the first milestone, I only need to basically show the landing page as is without any fancy logic. So let's run the application, see how it goes. One of the reasons I like IntelliJ that you can do a lot of, like, you can run the application from here, you can immediately see the application output in here, you can control it fairly easily with the run parameter, so it's pretty cool. But as I said, any application would do, any IDE would do. Right, so let's go to our localhost and see. So this is actually our application, our Spring Boot application serving our index template, and this index template is using the static files provided by our template we downloaded, and we see our first milestone up and running. So if I go back to the milestone, right, I see that my deliverable, and deliverable is an important idea about every milestone. So for the milestone, you in the end of every milestone, you're gonna have a deliverable. For different live projects, this means different things. Sometimes you're just gonna have a single file, like you need to produce, if you're doing like data science or something, you're gonna produce a single file, maybe with like a Python, what are we called, notebook, right? But for this project, you actually need to submit all of the source code. And you can do that easily using this command, and that's another reason to use Git basically. So you can not just have a version control just for you. Let me initialize the repo first. So this is absolutely empty application, right? I don't have anything. I don't even have repository, I think. Yeah, so I have multiple files. I can add them, right? And I can make my first commit and call it first commit. Cool. So these are my files from the template I downloaded, and literally the only file I created. Well, actually none of them. All of them are generated or downloaded from somewhere, but that's okay. That's just for the first milestone. So if I would be going through the course right now, I need to submit my solution now. So imagine you're working on that, right? You went through all of these steps, you read all the resources, you read about creating controllers, designing the views. Well, actually, I haven't done that. So let's maybe do that first, and then we submit our work. So imagine you're going through that, right? And to do that, to render the page, you also need to create a controller. As you can see, you don't really need to do that, right? That's a bit tricky. So we don't have any controllers, we don't have anything, and we still see the application landing page. It's not actually that weird, it just shows how cool Spring Boot is, because in fact, it knows that you have index template, and when you go to the main page of in your slash page, that's probably means you want to render this in the index template. And when you render it this index template, you don't need to write any code. If there is no logic, if there is nothing, there's absolutely no code you need to write. But let's write something just to basically show it, even an empty page, right? So I'm going to create a new controller class, and let's say I'm going to call it catalog controller, right? Controller. And if I go back to my live project, I can see now actually part of this book displayed right in my course, so I don't need to jump back and forth. I can just go and read about it. What is a controller? What is Spring MVC? How it works? I can navigate between different chapters. I can read about the different design decisions I need to make. And as you can see, that's actually there is this Taco controller, and that at the best indicator that you're looking at the source code from the book, because I know that probably Craig loved tacos. So, and this is an example of a controller in Spring in Action book, but you don't really need to copy that, right? So we don't need all of that now. So we're working on something very basics, very simple. So, but you can get some inspiration. You can actually see, okay, so he's using a request mapping and get mapping. That's probably what I need to do as well. So let's do that. So let's say we want to design a controller, and request mapping basically means on which URLs and which endpoints you want to map this controller to. And if you want to learn about controllers more, you can always get some info from the book. But for now, I'm just gonna return name of the controller. All right, so I'm gonna return index, and if I run the application now, I need to rerun it because I don't have Spring Boot DevTools enabled. If you enable Spring Boot DevTools, you don't even need to restart your application. Basically, the Spring Boot DevTools will automatically monitor for changes, and it will automatically refresh it. But for simplicity, I'm just going to restart it. Cool, nothing changed. But what is important now, we have a controller. So in this controller, what is happening? Not too much, basically, right? So what I'm saying is, I have a controller, I want to map it to a root of my website, and I want to serve my index template. And that's the thing, by the way, in Spring. So when you in Spring MVC, so when you have a controller and when your controller method returns a string, this means this is basically a name of your template. And again, you can learn much more about it from Craig's book and many other books on Spring, or from the official documentation as well. So imagine now I'm done with my first milestone. So I'm going to check one more time if I'm actually on track. So, all right, I designed the view, and view in my case is my mustache view, my template. And then it's time to submit my work. So now, because I do have this Git repository created, I can actually just export it easily, right? So if I go back to my command line, cool, I'm gonna add that, I'm gonna commit that and call it add empty controller. So now I need to submit that. So what I can do, I can just call a git archive command. So it will take all the files from the source code repo and then extract it into a zip file and call it, let's say, milestone1.zip. So now I can just basically upload this file directly into the Submit Your Solution page, or as Submit Your Solution page suggests, you can use, let's say, GitHub or GitLab or something to actually push your code from a Git repo and then show it to your mentor, basically. I'm not going to do it now. That's not the purpose, but there are plenty of options you can submit your solution. And why is it important? Because I said before that the choices I'm making now, like the view technology, the let's say build system, I'm using Gradle, not Maven. These choices are making these choices to align my solution I'm working on now with what is called the reference implementation. So the reference implementation is basically a final version of this application already built by me. And every time when you submit your work, when you submit a certain milestone solution, you're going to get access to the reference implementation, which is kind of my view on that, how I would implement that. So you can use this as an inspiration. If you're stuck, you can basically just submit something, even if it's not working. Don't worry too much. Just submit it away, and you'll get access to the reference implementation. So you can probably get some inspiration, some ideas from there. You can try to play with it. You can maybe even use, like, let's say, use the reference implementation to continue from on a certain milestone if you need to, like a foundation to carry on iterating and working on a project. That's super flexible. That's totally fine. Like, just submit your solution, whatever the state of the solution is, and then get access to the reference implementation and keep using that. And the reference implementation is using Mustache, Gradle, Java, and I think Java 11. So basically it is making some design decisions which you don't have to follow, but if you want to stick to reference implementation and be aligned with that, that's what you should do. Cool. Right. So the first milestone is ready. The application is up and running, but that's too simple, right? So in this example, is nothing really to show, and the purpose of the first milestone is just to get you up and running. So let's have a look at the second milestone, which is much more interesting and much more looks much more like a real project. You probably won't see something like setting up environment in a real project backlog, but you will probably something like build a catalog of items in a backlog. Cool. So let's have a look at this second milestone then. So in a second milestone, it's about building catalog. If you remember, we're working on an application for a bakery. So this catalog is most likely going to be pastries, bread, and cakes, and all the different stuff that bakery can sell. And what we need to do, we basically, at the moment, we need to focus on just displaying items on a page. That's another tricky thing is probably, and this another advantage of actually using something like this course to actually learn a bit of programming is you don't have to design everything together, right, in one go. So don't try to build like the whole website in one iteration. Just split it into milestones. Even if you're working on something on like in your day-to-day activity, just split it into milestones, define steps, and try to do that. So in a catalog, let's say we're not thinking about basket or like sessions or anything. The only thing we care about is just to display the list of items. In this application, I decided that the list of items will be coming from the database. So let's say if the business owners basically decide to update the catalog, well, it kind of sounds weird, the catalog for bakery, but if they basically decide to change what they have in this bakery, let's say they want to start making a new type of cake, let's say they had red velvet and they want to start selling Victoria sponge or something, they gonna need to change the database. Maybe they're gonna need to have some user interface for that, but that's outside of this project. So we're not doing any kind of admin UI to edit the items in the database. So instead, we're just gonna change them manually. Database is not the only solution. There could be probably like a CSV file or pretty much anything, right? So it could be even hard-coded to some extent. Like how often you get a completely new catalog in a bakery? Probably never, but anyways. So just for the purpose of the demonstration, for the sake of the completeness of the project, I decided to use the database. And in my example, I'm using Postgres database, but again, could be any database. Postgres is just quite easy to install, easy to get up and running, and quite, it's well known, and there's a lot of information about it online. So let's build a catalog for this. So we now have an empty landing page, right? So let's build a page that displays a list of available items from the database. So the purpose of this, the importance of these milestones is this is where we're going to establish the connectivity to the database. We're going to test, create a test infrastructure. And this is where it's getting interesting. We're going to get to that in a second. So the user story we're going to be working on is fairly simple. Given I have 6 items imported to the database, and again, it's not very realistic, so this imported is probably a bit vague. You don't know what it means, but in our case, let's say when you have data from this script in your database, then when you go to the homepage of Cake Factory website, you see the list of 6 items with title and price. And what is important, that the format of the price should be a pound sign and then price with 2 decimal digits. So that's an interesting. So this is just a kind of thinking exercise. Like, think about what is unclear, and that's one of the things I said. What does it mean to import data to the database? How actual business users would do that? But for the demonstration purpose, of course, we're not going to focus on that. But in a real project, you're probably going to need to solve and think about that. All right, let's have a look at the workflow. So what I had in mind when I actually created that, implement catalog controller. Okay, that sounds right. And that's probably, as I said, where things are getting interesting. So as I said, it's a good time to think about the architecture of your application and how would you approach that, and how would you separate your, basically, how you define your business domain, right? And that is something quite interesting. So you would expect the first step would be, add a Postgres Postgres database driver, add Spring Data JDBC or Spring Data JPA or one of the database access technologies provided by Spring. But that's actually not that. So the first step is actually write a test. And it probably doesn't make a lot of sense for some people who never tried test-driven development, but it's actually a very good technique you can use to write better software. So the advantage of that is you can design your system from the test perspective. So you can introduce better test boundaries, you get a better test coverage, you get more confidence that your code is working as it should work, even when you change it in the future. So let's actually start with a test. Again, in a real, if you decide to, if you would go for this project and you will actually start working on that, are you going to be using TDD or not? You're going to write tests first, a test last, or not write tests at all? It's up to you. So it's not the goal of this application. But for this stream, I'm just going to show you how I did that. Basically, how the reference implementation was written originally and how it's actually designed. So I'm going to follow the steps. These steps actually, I wrote them, so it shouldn't be that hard, right, to follow them. So I'm saying check different test configurations that Spring Boot offers. So what I can do, I can actually go there and see in a Spring documentation which types of tests do I have. And let's say in this one, I can see I can have a JSON test. It's probably not the case because I don't need JSON, right? I'm not gonna return any JSON data. Instead, I'm rendering the web pages using View Engine. So WebMVC test, that's something probably I need. Yeah, so WebMVC test look exactly as the type of the test I need for my controller. Okay, so that's something I need. And what else we have there? So I just checked the different test of the configurations, and now I'm actually going to add HTML unit dependency and create an interface for my service. All right, let's actually start step by step, and let's create a let's add a dependency for that. So the dependency is actually HTML unit, right? So HTML unit is going to be my test implementation dependency, and the HTML unit, you can go to the page of the HTML unit itself to find the right artifact. So in my case, that's actually example in Maven, but one of the reasons I really love IntelliJ, look at that, when you paste it, and if it's actually in Gradle format, in Maven format, it automatically converts it to Gradle format. Like, how cool is that? Right, so this is my dependency, and I don't really need to specify a version because Spring Boot will take care about the versioning for me. All right, so I have HTML unit now. What next? So the next one is create an interface for your service which will represent domain model. And that's where the tests are super useful. It helps you to think about your application not as a kind of single big ball of mud, as sometimes people call uncontrolled monoliths, but as a kind of well-structured, well-isolated application with clear boundaries between your components. And the tests, software tests, they really help you to define these boundaries and introduce these boundaries using like interfaces or something. So let's say I'm going to create a package now, right? So just for simplicity, and call it, I don't know, let's call it catalog. Right, and let's say I'm going to move this catalog controller in there, right? And yeah, let's keep it like that for a sec. So now what I need to do is, although I'm saying actually create an interface for the service and then write a test, what I want to do, I want to write a test first and then see how this interface may look like. So let me write a test first. So I'm going to create a test because I already checked out which are the available types of Spring Boot web tests. I know that I need web MVC test. And I'm saying that I need this WebMVC test for a controller called catalog controller. Yeah, it is. Yes. So now it's time to write a test. So the test is, and it's actually a perfect time to think about like, what is it you expect from your application to do? So I would say I expect that my application should display, let's start with something simple, title of a cake, right? And that's pretty much it. Let's stop here. So in any good test, you're gonna need to have multiple sections, which are fairly standard. Is sometimes they named as given, when, and then blocks. It's basically you can also read it as setup, then action, and then outcome. So in this case, you're basically saying given I'm in that state, when I do that, and I, in this case, maybe a user or someone, I expect that this has happened, right? So let's think about this test for a second. So setup. So in a setup, my given block will be I have. Let me actually write it first, right? So it doesn't harm. You can totally do that. So I have an item in. Let's not call it the database, in let's say a catalog, right? In the catalog. So when I go to the main page, then I have an item with title. Let's call it Red Velvet. I love Red Velvet. I wish I had one now. Right, so the outcome would be I see an HTML element with content Red Velvet, right? And now let's turn it into code. So now it's time to think about the boundaries of your application. So in my case, I'm probably going to have something called, doesn't exist yet, but let's say it's going to be something called catalog, just catalog maybe, right? And because I don't really like using these services, but I'm sure I use that a lot in a reference implementation because it's very common and you will see it a lot in the real code basis. You will see this blah 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 service everywhere. So feel free to use that if you want to, but you absolutely don't have to, right? So this class doesn't exist. Let's create one, and it's going to be our in our package. It's going to be catalog, and let it be an interface for now. So we don't know what the implementation is going to look like yet. And that's actually a great case when you can see how TDD and writing tests first helps you to define APIs in your code, right? So I don't really have to think too much about it. Like, what is it going to do? What is it going to return? What is it going to take? What's going to be the structure of this object? Doesn't matter. Write a test first. It will tell you what your interface should do, what your service should do. So let's say I'm going to say this dot catalog, and let's say I'm going to set it up into some sort of in-memory catalog. That's a fairly popular approach actually, to create like in-memory test doubles. Although that might be confusing. Let's keep it for now. We don't have much time, so let's do that. So let's use mocking technology for that. So I'm in the reference example, and pretty much in like 99% of Java code, you will see using Mockito, which is a Java testing mocking framework. So I'm just going to use that as well. So say I'm going to mock it. And mock, if you're not familiar with software testing, is basically like a not real implementation of something that you fully control. So this is the object that may look like a real object, but it's not actually a real object. It's just kind of looking like that, right? And in this case, let's say I want to say catalog.get all, right? No, sorry, this is a given block, right? So I'm saying when, and this is an example how can I control mock behavior using Mockito. So I'm saying when control my catalog is called with, let's say, get all. So when someone calls this get all method, then I want to return, in my case, let's say I want to return a stream of something to be decided, right? So the first thing to notice is there is this object doesn't exist. Let's create one. So let's say I want to return a catalog item, maybe. I don't know how to call it. Maybe it's going to be a cake, but it's probably not going to be a cake. It could be a like pastry or something. So let's call it catalog item, right? And we need a class for that as well. Yeah, so let's create one and call it red velvet. So by doing that, and we say, okay, it's going to return red velvet. So this method doesn't exist because the service is completely empty, and we're going to create one, right? So it's going to return a stream of, what is it, catalog item, I called it, right? And it's probably created in the wrong folder. Yeah. So I'm going to move it to my application, my main source directory instead of test directory. Yes, I want to refactor it. Cool. So that's, as you can see, my interface is getting some shape now, right? So we know that it's going to return something, and this something is going to be, you know what, let's not use stream, let's use list. It might be a little bit easier to follow. So, and in here, I'm going to do a list of, right? Right, so let's say now I know that my interface should have this method called getAll. This getAll should return a list of elements. Every element is going to be a catalog item, and catalog item potentially going to have some properties, and it's probably time to define them as well. So let's say I'm going to set title of that to red velvet. Cool. The property doesn't exist, so I'm going to create one. Cool. So as you can see from the test, you can tell, all right, for this particular test, I only need title. And that's super important. So don't try to define all these properties you need on your entity, in your interface, in your service. Like, just start small. Think about, like, this test is focusing on the title. Just do the title, nothing else. So, and we know that when we call this catalog implementation, we're going to return, let's say, this red velvet, right? So when I go to the main page, so this is interesting now. So what does it mean to go to the main page? And this is where we're going to need our HTML unit, right? So in here, I'm going to inject a special class of type mock MVC. So for people not familiar with Spring yet, AutoWired basically basically means go and find an implementation of this class in application context and inject it into this field. So Spring will create one for me and give it to me. So this mock MVC is a HTTP testing tool which we can use actually to access the pages directly, right? So we can now and then do mock MVC.perform, and then we can do like a different actions on that. Right, so let's say we want to go to our main application page. You know what, let's start with just using pure mock MVC, nothing else, no HTML unit yet. If we have enough time, then I'm going to show you how to use HTML unit for that as well, which is quite cool. And here we can actually say, right, when we went to this page, we expect that body or content maybe. So these all things, like I remember some of them, but you don't have to remember. It's all documented in Spring documentation. So you can always go online to spring.io, go to reference implementation, and find all of these things in how to test applications, how to write applications, and also you can find a lot of it in this resources in the course itself. So you can learn about like different aspects of testing. You can learn about integration testing. You can learn about developing web applications. Let's say how to write controllers and views. And in there, I think in a resources section. So I'm gonna go all the way down to resources section. Yeah, you can see basically. Yeah, if you go to this link, I think I've been there already. Yeah, you can go there and you can see all about Spring testing, right? So if you're writing, let's say, mock MVC test, you can find all the different things you can get. Like you can find this given. This is actually using Mockito, which is quite nice. Then you can see this example of using mock MVC. You can see how to use that, how to like what to expect. You can find different examples of using HTML units, Selenium, auto configuration. So all of this is in the documentation basically, and you can find the links in the course itself. I'm not jumping back and forth just because I've seen it like thousands of times already, so just know it already. But feel free to kind of spend before you get into writing tests, just to pause and then think about it, read about it, learn about it, and then try to write the test. Cool. So let's say content, and I expect it contains string that contains a substring red velvet, right? So I'm probably doing something silly here, right? Request matcher. Yeah, what am I using? Result matcher. All right, let's go to the documentation and see how it's supposed to work. So we go to expect, status is okay, content string, blah, blah, blah. So, but I don't want it to be a string. I actually want it to be a matcher, right? So that's a request matcher, and this should be a result matcher. Yes, I just picked the wrong one. Sorry for that. Yeah. So, and I say it should be something that contains red velvet. Cool. So basically this means when my mock service returns that, when I go to the page, then I see, so we kind of combine these two, right? So this is my when, and this is my then. So it's all right. Cool. So that's what we have. I'm going to remove this for now. We don't need that. So we have setup, action, and outcome. So let's run it and see what does the test tell us. So while it's starting, I think what is important is we have an interface, right? But we don't have an implementation. But that's okay, because this is not what we're working on. So we're working on a controller. We're only working on the implementation now. So it's probably gonna tell me that this output does not contain red velvet. It should be somewhere like it is basically trying to bring the whole output, so which is a bit confusing, but Yeah, response content expected, but was blah blah blah. Yeah. So basically, what it tells us that, you know, the element is not there. So let's put it there. So we now have an interface. We know that this interface is going to return the data we expect. So let's pass it to the controller. So I'm going to use another type of, as I mentioned before, you can use AutoWire to inject objects of a certain type into your application, into your classes, basically. So what I can do something like catalog, and then basically give me a catalog. And I just realized, sorry, that what I need to do, I don't need to create it manually. Instead, I'm going to need to put a mock bin on that. So with this mock bin definition, what Spring Test will do, it will create a mock instance of this catalog and then inject it into the application context. So my classes and test classes can use that. Right? So I'm injecting that using this AutoWired, and you can see IntelliJ is actually telling me that the field injection is not recommended. It's fine for tests, but for production code, I would say always follow best practices and use constructor injection. And the beauty of constructor injection is you don't have any extra annotations in there, right? You just say, give me instance of that, and Spring will give you instance of that particular class. Cool, so now we have an instance of catalog, right? Let's try to get the data out of it. So you see this get all, I defined it just a few seconds ago in a test, right? And what I can do now, I can use it to actually return not just view, but return model and view. That's another feature of Spring MVC. So when you can return a combination of a view, which is a template basically, and some information to render into that. Again, don't worry that it looks like it's too much information. All of this is in here. So if you go to the relevant parts of the, if you go to this, resources section, you can find links to the relevant books, articles, and different resources that can help you to learn about all of these aspects. So in my case, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a map of, I'm going to create a property of this model called, let's say, items, right? And I'm going to pass my catalog in there. Cool. So now if I run a test, guess what? It's going to fail. But that's intentional. That's by design, right? Because we're now returning the model, but we're still not rendering anything into that. So now the model actually gets it, but invalid. Oh, actually not. Look at that. And that's contains. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm doing it right. Don't I? Yeah, so what I'm saying is basically when you run the test, because nothing is rendered yet, so it's going to fail, but now it's actually failing even before that. And it's unhappy about using this contains. That's really weird. It doesn't, yeah, because it's absolutely not the right contains. Contains string. A nice trick I actually can recommend you if you never, as me, is if you never remember all of these matchers, request matchers, all of this, and let's say if you don't remember all the Hamcrest matchers as well, you can just start typing, I think it's called matchers, yeah, and you can do string containing substring maybe. Contain string, there we go. Contain string, that's it. Right, so now I can actually finally import that, right? And if I run a test now, it's still gonna fail, but that's okay because again, the view is not yet implemented. So we're getting the data from our service, not the database yet, give it to the view, and not rendering anything. Yeah, there we go, back to the same failure. Let's fix it now. So let's go to the template. And let's find where do we want to put the data. So I collapsed all the HTML blocks and then went to my, so let's go to the body. So I would think if I go to my landing page is that I want to display items in here. That's kind of obvious, right? So instead of these 6 items, I want to display something returned by my service. And let's do that. So let's expand that, and so this is left. This is the sidebar on the left. This is my main content. So this is my carousel. I'm not gonna touch that. And these are my 6 demo items. I'm gonna remove all of them. Right, and now I can actually render my template. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take all the items, all right, and I'm going to display a title in a card title, right? So this is item 1. Instead, I'm gonna show, I think it's called just title, right? And if I run it now, my test should pass now. Hopefully. Never passes from the first try, so oh cool, that's green. Yeah, so that's amazing, right? And now thanks to the test, we have an interface, we have a data model, we have a view, and the data model with just one property as well. But that's fine. If you need more, just write more tests, right? If you want to add, let's say, price, you can say I want to do, should display title of the cake, should display price of a cake, right? Oops, maybe too much. So display price, and let's say we say red velvet set price, and let's say it will be big decimal of what is going to be $3.95. Is it a fair price? Right. So now we're setting the price property. Yeah. Cool. So you see, we're kind of reshaping our data model, our services, our code, basically following guided by tests. Now 395, we expect it to include 395. I'm kind of, cutting some corners now, because ideally you don't want to check that, some value actually is just in a HTML output of your page. What you want to do is actually you want an HTML unit, you want to use HTML unit to find element on the page, let's say find a particular card, and then within that card you want to test that property is what you expect. Let's say the title is what you expect, the price is what you expect, etc. For the simplicity, I'm not doing that, but in the real world scenario, the test can be a little bit more complicated, right? So instead of doing that, you would probably do something like find card with title red velvet, and then get price from this card, right? So in a real project, it's going to be something like that. Cool. For now, let's just run that, see how it works, and fix this, and move on to the next part. So again, it's gonna fail because the property is there, it's not rendered. And now we can just go to our template, find our price, right? And then did I call it price? I think I did call it price. Some people will actually notice that it's gonna fail now, right? Do you know why? I bet you know why. No. Even I didn't know it's gonna fail like that. Look, everything is broken and we don't know how to fix it. Cool. Oh, the title is not there. Yes, so this is actually quite good, and this is why you need to write tests, right? So now we know that, let's say for this one, the price is not there, and that's one easy to fix. That's what I wanted to show. It's basically we're still using the $sign, right? So if I change my $sign to £sign, the new test will pass, the old one will fail. You would ask why? Because by default, Mustache is not happy about when you're trying to render a property which is not there in a model. So we're trying to render a price on something that doesn't have a price. Let's say in this case, I'm not setting the price, and that's why it's failing. And this is actually how tests can tell you that, if in this particular setup, if you're trying to do that, everything's going to crash, everything's going to break. So the beauty of this approach that you can fix it before you actually ship it, before you release it to customers, before you actually someone sees that, right? So I can quickly fix that, and after I run it again, we should have all the tests green. So the logical desire to do is actually just to run the application. Do you think it's going to run? No, it's not, sadly, because the thing is, we were working on tests and we defined our catalog service, but there is no implementation of that. So we do have a mock version of that in tests, but we have nothing in our real application. So let's try to implement one. Let's finally connect to the database. So again, in a real world, let me do that. I'm not going to call it implementation. Instead, I'm going to call it a JPA catalog or something, right? So in a real world, it's probably going to be a little bit more complicated, but it's fine. So this is a JPA catalog, right? This is the implementation. And what I need to do now, I need to somehow get the data from the database and actually display it in here, and not even display it. That's the beauty of the test. So the boundary, the responsibility of the test is just to return a list in here. So the thing is, I don't really have much time, so I can try to go through a TDD cycle again, because ideally what I would do is I would do something like that, you know, implement a test and then say this is a JPA, data JPA test, right? Data JPA test, and then I can write some data into that. Actually, you know what? Let's not step away from the best practices. Let's write a test. So now you think about it like I'm testing the same interface from different sides, right? So on my view side, I'm just testing, you know, if I get the data from it, I can display it on a page. On the data side, I'm testing that if I have data in a database, I can actually extract it from the database and return it as my business domain object, right? So that's what I'm doing now. So if I go back to my test, I say should load data from database. I can also split it, like, you know, into title and price separately, but I'm not going to do it now, just for simplicity, right? And again, maybe to make things a bit faster, let's maybe not use Postgres for now, just for the purpose of the stream, but let's use H2 database, which is an in-memory database we can use. So I'm going to show you another cool trick. So if you want to add something to a Spring Boot project, you don't know how, let's say, if you want to add H2, but you don't remember what the dependency is, you can always go back to the second best place on the internet, and you can guess what's the best place on the internet, or you can watch one of the Josh Long and talks and then find it out from there. So let's say if you don't know how to add H2 dependency, you can just type H2, and then you can click Explore button, and you're going to see it right here. So basically you can see the project without downloading that. You can see the project generated by initializer. Cool, let's add that. Yeah, so we have H2, and it's time probably for us to add Spring's data JPA. So the Spring data JPA will bring default JPA implementation, which is Hibernate, and we're going to use H2 as our database, right? So let's now implement our database layer. So again, go back to our catalog, go to the test, and let's say again, remember this given one then, let's write a test first. So we say, let's say when we have data in a database, right? I'm gonna trick a little bit in here. So I'm gonna use another cool feature of Spring Boot. So you can use plenty of tools for your database loading the data in the database for your database in it. You can use migrations, you can use plenty of tools actually. But again, for this example, for the stream, I'm going to be using Spring Boot own mechanism for that. So, and it's called Spring Boot data initialization. So if I create a file called schema.sql, and if I create, and then I can then define my schema, let's say I want to create a table, and this table is going to be called catalog, let's call it, right? And I'm going to have an ID. That's an interesting one. So I don't know, I would probably, normally I wouldn't start from creating a schema in a database. I would probably ask my tests what it should be. And maybe we should do that really. As I said, let's not step away from the best practices, even if it's short on time. Let's spend another 5 minutes on that. So let's do that. Let's create new cake entity this time, not cake entity, but catalog item entity, right? Let's create one. It doesn't exist. create it. Oops, sorry, not the right one. Let's create one, and it's gonna be an entity, and it's gonna be a identity attribute. Well, I'm not gonna do that yet. So, and now I can think about what should be the properties of my entity, right? So, and the properties I see there is the first one is probably some sort of SKU, which is basically, we can use some auto-generated ID, but normally in for things like catalog items or something, you usually have unique numbers or something you could identify, right? Let's say I can call it red velvet or something. So the SKU is basically my my unique identifier of this record, right? And I'm gonna do that, and now I'm gonna define ID. So this is gonna be my unique identifier of the record in the database. And IntelliJ is happy now. This means we're happy as well. And let's say when my entity has this title called red velvet, right? And I have a property of that. And then when I save this database, save this to the database, again, ideally, we want to use test entity manager, right, to save it. Say persist, and we say we want to persist this entity. Cool. So this is our given. So when this record is in a database, when we call this, how do we call it? We call it JPA catalog, I think, right? Catalog. So we call this catalog.getAll, right? And this is our actual items, right? And we assert that. Oh, this is, by the way, this is assert J testing framework, assertion framework. You can use any assertion framework you want, but in the reference implementation use that, right? So I'm gonna import that, yeah, and assert that actual items. Let's say extracting catalog item title. So we want to only get title, right? Get title, and now we want to say that that actually contains my red velvet, right? Sometimes you can even do like nice tricks, like extract this into a variable to get a better readability. So you can say this is actually actual title or something. So now if you change it, you don't have to change it in two places, right? So you say that expected actual items, what it's actually not actual, right? It's expected title. So yeah, we take actual items, we extract the title from it, and we check that it actually contains the expected title. Cool. So yeah, this instance is not yet created, and it's not auto-wired, because if you check the data JPA implementation, it doesn't actually auto-wire your user components for you. And this is my user component, right? It's not part of JPA. So what I can do now is I can either manually craft it in this in my code, or I can also just import my configuration. And I can say JPA catalog.class. So it will basically automatically create a component for me. And if I mark it as a component, yeah, it will be automatically discovered by my test. So now let's run a test. Cool. Let's run it. Just waiting for that. Yeah, so the thing is now, it's probably going to fail. But that's all right, that's expected. And why is it expected? Because now we don't have our, script cannot be null empty. Okay, fair enough. So let's pretend it's not yet there. So if we run it, we're gonna get an exception that a database is there, because Spring Boot will automatically configure a database for us, but it won't have any schema. So without schema, we're gonna see an exception probably from, so it's null. Oh yeah, because it is now, right? Because it's not doing anything. Before we get to the schema, probably we need to do a little bit more, right? So now we want to say, okay, we want to access the database and we want to get the data from there. So again, let's use constructor injection and then inject special type, and the special type is actually a repository. And the repository is it's a concept from Spring Data JPA. I'm going to show it in a second, basically how it works. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to inject my how do you call it, catalog item entity, right? It's called catalog repository, maybe, for simplicity again. So it's going to be catalog repository, right? And we're gonna create one. And we're going to use it, we're going to be using a dependency injection from Spring. So if you go to our catalog repository, and that's actually where the Spring Data magic kicks in. Again, if you want to learn more about it, and if you're following the course, you can go to, let's say, persisting data with JPA, with Spring JPA section, and you can learn about all of these aspects I just discussed. You can see the different technologies for accessing the data. You can read about the dependencies. You can read about like how do you define entities, how you define schema. You can like plenty of information about that from Craig Wall's book called Spring in Action. And you can see all the different aspects actually of that all in here. That's super useful. You can get a lot of info from there. But for now, imagine we just read this chapter, and I know that what I'm gonna need to do is I need to extend a special class provided by Spring Data, and it's called CRUD repository. And I'm gonna be using my catalog item entity, and as an ID, I'm gonna be using string, right? It kind of looks like magic, but we don't have any implementation of this interface. But that's all right, because Spring Data will actually create one for us. It will connect it to the database and get the data from the database. Again, not going to focus on that. That's all in the book, all in the course. Just, spend some time reading about it. It's all there. So in this case, I'm just injecting the dependency generated by Spring Boot. And now I can say, all right, I'm going to take this catalog repository. It's important to mention that the data is different, format is different, right? So the catalog contains entities and my business domain contains business entities, basically. So in my case, they look the same, but they don't have to. Because let's say normally, and I think this is actually in the reference implementation, I just missed that a little bit. So let's say normally when you have something, let's say, to display like a view model, basically, you don't want to pass a price as a big decimal. You want to format it somewhere, and then you want to basically just render it as a string. So your view is not responsible for rendering data. It's only responsible for displaying data. And let's say the actual conversion from big decimal from money format to string happening somewhere else. Again, in here is probably not that representative, but in the real projects and the large projects, it could be important to separate this. Sometimes they look the same, but they actually, database entities and business entities, they look the same, but they're not the same. So just be careful with that. So in my case, let's say I'm just got all the information from the database, right? So I need to now convert it into my business entities, and I'm going to be using stream utils, I think it's called. Yes. No, it's not stream utils. It's Spring support. Yeah, that's it. So I can create a stream using this split iterator, and I'm not going to run it in parallel. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to take an entity. Oops. Right. And I'm going to create a new catalog item, which is now from my business domain. It has no relation to database whatsoever. So this, the beauty of this class, it has no links to database, to JSON, to anything. So it's completely free of all the infrastructure concerns, and it doesn't have any Spring dependencies at all. So now I can actually get the data from my entity. It's no price, but that's all right. So let's say I only need title, right? Oops. Set title, and let's say I need to set some price, and let's set it to 0 for now. Cool. And so I'm going to return it. this item, and now I need to collect it into list because this is what my data model expects, right? So if I run a test now, so what will happen? This catalog repository implementation will be generated by Spring Data. Spring Data will give me the implementation of that. My code will call it, get to the database, get the data from the database, map it into business entity, and return it. And it's great, cool. And so at the moment, what we need to do as well is maybe we need to create some test data. I started actually talking about that a second ago, about the schema and actually defining the schema. And in most of the cases, you do need that. You do need to define schema, but because we're using JPA with embedded database, Spring Boot is actually smart enough to automatically generate a schema for us. So we don't need to worry about it, but with not embedded database or with different implementation of persistence, you may need to actually create a schema file to write the data, actually to define the schema. But now we only need to define data. So I'm gonna go back to my, let's say, to my description for a second and see what's there. So in my user story, I see that I want to have 6 items, blah, blah, blah. And I see this mention of data SQL file. So if I scroll all the way down, it's where it is. Cool. And I'm not sure what's going to be the name of this auto-generated table, but my wild guess will be, actually, let's not guess it, let's define it, right? We can give it a name, right? We can say the name is items something, right? And then I can now use it in my script. Cool. And if I rerun the test just in case to see what's happening, it should pass. But in addition to actually getting the green test, we're in a much better state now. No, it's not passing. That's good. I don't know why it's good yet. Column count does not match. Oh yes, that's true. Because as I said, it automatically generates all the column, all the schema for you, right? And in our schema, we only have 2 fields, so we don't have price yet. And although it's weird, but we're not testing that yet, so I don't have a test for that. And let's maybe ignore that for now. Well, it's actually super quick to add it, right? So let's quickly add it. So string, it's not going to be a string, right? It's going to be a big decimal. Again, I would normally start with a test and say, okay, so why do we have this? When I fetch the data from the database, I expect that my title is actually set from the database, and then my price is set from the database, etc. But for now, I think it's fine, right? So we don't test it explicitly in our test, but we can totally do that if we want to. So we can add another assertion, and its assertion we can test that, you know, it's not title, but it's the price we expect. So let's run it again. So now the generated schema will include 3 columns, and 3 columns will be ID, title, and price. And then it's still gonna fail, and that's also good. Yeah, it's not happy about all butter croissant. Let's maybe define columns explicitly. String, string, string. So it's all string, right? Title, price. Should be all good, but yeah, let's maybe define it more specifically. So we say it's good, title, and price, right? That's what we need actually. That's weird. Maybe it wasn't such a bad idea actually to just remove price from it and then don't do that. But that's all right. So yeah, I don't know why I didn't in the first place. So yeah, if you run it now, we expect that the data will be in a database. We also insert some data in our test. That's a good question actually, how we're gonna how do we want this data to coexist next by together, but we can decide basically. So in a test we can say I want to generate maybe unique description, I want to generate unique ID, I want to generate something, and that's why, let's say, because we have red velvet in our test data, and this test data will be rendered into the database on our test run, maybe we don't want to use this red velvet anymore as an example. Maybe we want to use some random string, like, I don't know, some random cake name. And now, because we're using that in everywhere, we don't need to change anything, right? The test should still pass. But it's not, because we have primary key violation. Oh yes, because we're using the same ID as in here, right? So we're trying to inject something with the same key, right? So let's generate a unique ID, some random key name. Right, so now this data will be injected by Spring, the data from data.sql, and we're also going to insert some test data from the test itself, and now we get a green test. But as I said, we're in a much better state now, because we not just have a green test, but we do have, in fact, we have two green tests, right? So if I run the whole test suite, I'm going to see controller tests and I'm going to see database tests all green. But the beauty of that, using test-driven approach, we actually defined our business entities, which are our catalog item and our catalog. We defined our implementation of the persistence, which is JPA. Again, if you want to swap, let's say, JPA to something different, we only need to change one class, but nothing else in our application. And we know how to get the data from this business domain, business entities, and how to display it on a page. And now, if you run our application, something exciting should happen. Well, not too exciting, you know, in the end, it's just showing a few items from the database on a page, but still, it's pretty cool. So, and it's actually the first time I see my, so I started working on tests. I never refreshed the page in my browser. So I used tests to actually, as an interactive development environment. And now that's the first time I see it all together. And I immediately see that, because remember when I said that I'm not testing that, but that's okay. Well, it's not, because I'm not testing that. That's immediately broken. The price is not correctly displayed. Because in our JPA catalog test, in here, I'm asserting on title, but I'm not asserting on price. Get price, and then let's say, if I say entity, I would normally, again, I would maybe write it as a separate price even. Let's say big decimal, big decimal 10. Let's say set it to 10. Why do you keep doing that? Yeah, that's the one I need. Yeah, so let's say when I set the price to 10, right, then I expect this 10 to be probably included in output. Again, in a real code, that's not how you would do that. You would get the record from the database by ID, maybe, or just maybe find it in a, or maybe go through all the items in your get all output, and then you check that this title and price, they actually belong to the same item, but that's all right. I'm not going to do that now. I'm cutting some corners now, but that's all right. So now it's supposed to fail because we're not actually, in our get all method, we're not mapping the price. We're just setting it to 1 everywhere. Instead, we want to do entity.getPrice. Cool. So the test is green now, and even more importantly, the application is functional now. So let's see how the test is doing. It's a bit slow today. It's probably due to some of the screen sharing software running and everything, but that's all right. All right, so the test is green, the app is running. It is not, but it will be there in a second. All right, all started, yes. And now we see the prices are correct. It's actually not a bad price for a fresh baguette. All right, and that's the end of the milestone 2. As I said, the real milestone in a live project, it contains a lot of resources and the references to all the potential, to all the information you may need. But just for the sake of this stream, I think that's probably enough for us for today. So if you're interested about that, if you like this approach, if you're interested in building Spring Boot applications, modern Spring Boot applications, and especially e-commerce applications end to end. Totally go and check out this live project called Building an E-commerce Web Application with Spring Boot. It's going to guide you through the milestones. So we finished, let's say, building catalog. The next one is an interesting one, is adding a basket, and then you will learn about managing sessions and separating data between different sessions and a bean and the different scopes of different beans in Spring container. And then you will learn about some bits of Spring security, how to create a user sign up page and user login page. Then you will learn how to integrate this security module with Spring Security Auth and how to log in using Facebook. Then you will learn how to integrate with PayPal and set up all the test accounts and everything for the PayPal integration. And then in the end, you will even learn how to package and deploy your application using Docker into AWS EC2 and how to see it live in a public internet. So you can find all of this in this live project. It's all there with all the resources, and hopefully you're gonna find it interesting, so go and check that out. And the link is in the chat window, and I think you can find it on the Manning page as well. So if you go to this course now, basically you're gonna get a 40% discount, which is not bad. And overall the project is there, and feel free to go and check it out, ask any questions, and I hope you enjoyed the stream. And with that, I'm gonna say goodbye and hopefully see you again soon.